Okay, so we've got kind of casual Fridays going on today, but I do have my office partially more officially set up with books in the back. I'm also, in case anyone's wondering what these dangling things are, I had challenges to or people concerned about audio on some of the other videos when they were using headphones. So I'm going to try this and see if it works. This video is meant to be more practical and specifically focusing on how to deal with open-ended and challenging assignments. Um, it's not uncommon for instructors to give prompts that have very specific direction and specific goals. And I do that sometimes too. But every now and then, and more lately, I've been trying to establish a broad framework for my projects so that students have a lot more wiggle room on how they can engage with it so that they can find the part of it that resonates or is meaningful with them. So this is a challenge. But it's really beneficial on a number of levels. It's a challenge because if you're used to being told, write a three-pronged essay or a five-paragraph essay, or with a strong thesis and persuade me of something, or write on some political issue or whatever it is, or here's a text, analyze it based on metaphor, or whatever the project is. If with those very specific directives, um, instructors tend to get a lot of very similar essays back, um, but not necessarily essays that are meaningful to the students. So what I try and do with my projects is I try and set a broad spectrum of possible of range. There are parameters often guided by our course content or a particular focus. But students can find their way in. So, for instance, if I'm having students write an essay about the linguistic aspect of writing, if I'm just trying to get them warmed up into all the different components that could be involved, students don't have to write on an essay on every component of the linguistic aspect of writing. Often I'll have the content from my class and the practical application in their lives, and I want them to find a way to marry those together in a meaningful way for themselves and for their readers. So when we're thinking about writing for when we're thinking about writing something like that, instead of me telling you, write an essay about how morphology shows up at your workplace, how morphology shows up on social media, how morphology shows up um, when you're writing a grocery list or at the grocery store. Instead of me giving very specific directives like that, I say, pick a linguistic component of writing, morphology, semantics, syntax, pragmatics, phonology, phonetics, whatever it is, and pick one of those, find a everyday context. Where do you see it? Write about that. Tie it together. Help us understand how that works on a practical level in your everyday life. You can either start with, some people like kind of a content to world, and other people like a world to content. Some might call this a top down to bottom up. So if we start at the class content, you may pick one linguistic component and then you apply it to a variety of everyday contexts that you have, just not so many that it's really shallow. What you want is depth, whatever you're going to write about. Alternatively, some people will start with something they really like because they don't care about the writing, they just kind of have to do it. So start writing about something you really like and see which of the variety of linguistic aspects apply to this one context. Each of those things can give a focal point, a centering to your essay, so that maybe the first chunk of your essay, I don't care about paragraphs, the first chunk of your essay is about morphology if you're at the gym. The second chunk may be how pictographic writing systems show up at the gym. And the third or fourth or fifth chunks might be how phonetics or phonology or something else shows up at the gym. That's one way in. Alternatively, it could be, how does morphology show up? And chunk one might be when I'm working, chunk two maybe when I'm driving, chunk three maybe when I'm talking with mi abuelitas, right? So that, whatever the case. Um, and so students can choose how they build their essay, and they can either take it from course content first or thing they're interested in first, as long as with my projects, often as long as they're marrying whatever the content, the big parameter is, to their everyday context, there's a broad spectrum of possibilities that tends to give students a way, give students the opportunity to find something meaningful in it for them while still writing about writing. In other times, I'll have students write about like culture, and the how the writing, specifically writing culture. So they may start with the writing concepts and find a culture, or they may start with the culture and go to the writing concepts. So what are the common genres? Maybe they like genre and they want to know, oh, I want to see how genre shows up in everyday life. So they look at genres of business, and so they go and they're like, I had to write a resume today, so this, or I had to do a job application, so this, and this is how principles of genre show up. Or they may look at what a specific culture first, and they may say, okay, I want to write about my math class, or I want to write about my specific workplace. And so then I go into my math class and I say, okay, where do I see writing show up? So then they go, okay, power documents or text. Okay, there are specific genres. Students take notes, and so there are all these different ways in, and so it can work back and forth both ways. Here's where the challenge comes. When a project is that open, sometimes I see students go, I don't know what to do, and then they'll just either pick something random, which they won't enjoy, um, or they get overwhelmed and think they have to cover everything at once, and then they overwhelm and shut down, and then they don't turn in draft after draft after draft, and then the final draft comes, and then they're stuck and they fail, or hopefully they don't. Hopefully, if they do, it's a little F failure, and we can work through it and find a better process. But what the important thing, though, with any of those is, again, I set my spectrum broadly so that each student can go deep and specific. So mine's broad and a little vague, and sometimes intentional. The parameters are intentionally set in a hazy way. Sorry if you don't like it. It's my style. I think it's good for you. Um, but that's so that, again, students can zoom in to a specific thing deeply in a way that is meaningful for them, so that they can make it meaningful for their readers. Because often in my classes, I am not the main reader. For the last year and a half, 2 years, my students do most of the final assessments on grades. Doesn't mean I don't read them. I read the papers, and will give feedback at any point, at any draft, at any time. I'll give feedback early, really messy, talk with students for anywhere from 5 minutes to 2 hours, depending on what the student wants. Same thing post. But students, I often have be the primary readers, and then they'll usually get assessments from other students using a community-based assessment model. I borrow scholarship from Asao Inoue, Wei Ju, and a couple others on the importance of feedback, and it's better to give than receive, and this kind of that sort of model. But since it's not just writing for an audience of one, that means that students often are pushed to not just cater to the teacher or what they think I'll like, or not care because it's just Greg, who cares, that jerk. And instead they're like, oh gosh, my fellow students are gonna, or my fellow writers are gonna actually read this, because it's almost like writing was designed to be read. So anyways, we'll just let that hang. So suffice to say, the challenge of open projects is that you have to take responsibility for them, and you have to find a way in, and you have to decide what you actually care about within the parameters given. It's not just write an essay on the Civil War, and you end up writing about slavery, and then the teacher's bored because, yeah. Instead, if someone does ever ask you, just here's how it might apply in another class. If someone ever does ask you to write an essay on the Civil War, don't just write this broad spectrum, really deep. Civil War involved slavery and money, and yeah, there was Abraham Lincoln and a bunch of cool people, and that sort of thing. Instead, sometimes it makes more sense to zoom in, maybe on one of those key concepts, uh, as it applied to a specific moment in time through the Civil War. And then you use that one moment in time, you analyze it deeply based on whatever lenses the history class gave you, and suddenly that writing becomes more meaningful even to an instructor who's an expert. So, because you've honed in on a unique moment in time that had broader implications. Just a thought. If you're a history professor and you don't like it, feel free to comment. With that, I'm going to stop this video because it's already 10 minutes and it was supposed to be a quick one. So again, they're complex on their openness. The openness is intentional. We want we want writers learning how to write for complex, open-ended, hard to define things, because then they have to define some things for themselves. And that's part of adulting and generally, but it's also part of being a meaningful writer and not just someone who puts words on the page. Now, the process for this can be really messy. Early on, it may feel like you've got 12 things going on in your brain all at once. So then as you start looking at it, you see what's resonating more with me. I wrote all this stuff of 4 or 5 ideas. What do I seem to be enjoying most? Or what seems to have the most meat to it for me? Or what am I drawn to? Or what do I think my readers are going to like most based on what I've started with? And so sometimes your first and second drafts are these kind of brainstorming sessions. And then your third draft, you start honing in and trying to see, okay, what's the most important thing to me right now? What do I want to spend a little more time on? So those are some pointers. Those are some ideas. So again, I hope this worked. I hope the extra audio worked. I know it's not tie or vest or even much of hair. What if you care? Sorry. But enjoy it, have fun, and I'll talk to you later.